Alright, today we're going to be doing the driver front lower control arm on my work van. Stay tuned. So I got the van pulled into the garage today. It's actually not a terrible day outside, but it is windy as hell. This wind is absolutely brutal out here. I know it doesn't look like it right now, but you get these random gusts of wind. So decided I'd go ahead and do it in here. And you can see, maybe, let me turn this light on and we'll get behind the wheel here. You can actually see what the issue is. That tire's got a whole lot of movement there. Definitely a bad bushing. So, we got a whole new one over there under warranty from O'Reilly's. So let's get started. Alright, so I got the wheel off, and you do not have to do this, but I want to get the camber and caster as close as possible to what it was when I took it off. So I went ahead and put a little bit of tire marking paint on there, so that way the spot under the strut will not be painted. Same thing with this nut. There should be a hole that is not painted here behind it. Not a hole, but a circle rather. And so I'm going to just try to line this back up exactly where it was before. You know, you don't have to do that if you're planning on getting an alignment, and I may or may not get one. It really just depends on how things turn out, but I am going to try to get it as close as possible to what it was before. So, got the wheel off, got that done. Next thing I'm going to do is start taking out the CV axle nut and cotter pin. We're going to get the tie rod removed. We're also going to take the caliper off just by the two bolts here and the lower one, and we're going to hang it up on the strut. Okay, so the first thing I did was I took the cotter pin out of the nut down here. It was on the bottom. I was able to do that by hand actually, because it hasn't been too long since this has been off. Then I went ahead and cleaned it up a little bit. Took the nut off. It was an 18 millimeter. And then I smacked it a couple times right here with a hammer. I was able to get that tie rod in to pop out of there. Next thing I did was I took the wheel speed sensor out of its little retainer here on both sides. This is the front and back, just like that. And it routes up to this hole, that oval shaped one. And that's going to be this piece right here. It's one of those little Christmas tree clips. You can get that out with a tool like this, and then up here you have to use that same tool, and those two holes next to each other is where it sits in. It'll pry out of that, and you can unplug it from the connector, and then you can kind of see those two little Christmas tree clips where it plugs into those two holes up there. Because this bolt doesn't want to come out too easily, seemed like it was going to break. So it's almost always easier to just remove it that way. So now that the tie rod is off, I can turn this easy. And we can take off those two bolts there on the caliper, and we'll hang it up on the strut. Okay, so once you get those 21 millimeter bolts removed, you can go ahead and hang your caliper up like so, and then the rotor should slide right off. If it does not, you can tap it in this area between the studs and it should come off, or if you're replacing it as well, you can just tap it from the back side. So now I'm going to go ahead and remove those bolts that hold the strut to the knuckle, and then I'm also going to remove the nut that holds the ball joint on, and then we just have to tackle the control arm here. And this is where the job gets a little interesting, because a lot of people want to pull off this entire plate underneath the bottom there. You can see that right there. I do not wish to do that, because as you can see, Well, maybe you can tell. I got a bunch of Bondo. This side's not the bad side, but this thing was super rusty when I got it. And so I really do not wish to take those bolts out that go directly into the chassis, because they're probably going to break, or best case scenario, they're going to be extremely rusty and hard to remove. Plus there's a whole bunch of bolts in this thing, and I'd really rather not remove all of that just to get the rear bushing out of there when it can slide out in most cases. I've done this job probably at least 4 times on these vehicles, and I've never had to remove that plate. It is a bit of a struggle, but you can make it happen. So we're going to go ahead and get this knuckle pulled out. Strut bolts, CV axle nut, and the ball joint nut. Okay, so I got the strut to knuckle bolts off, and I got the axle nut off. And you can see what I'm talking about here. I just line that up where it meets the orange, and then there's a circle there with no paint. That's where I line up the bolt. I guess I should also explain the reason I'm doing that is because the upper hole is a complete circle, or a regular circle, whereas this is an elongated hole, and it's designed to adjust your camber. And so that is why it will not just bolt up the same way every time. It needs to go in a certain position, or my alignment will be way off. It's probably going to be adjusted a little off anyways, but like I said, I want to get it as close as possible, because otherwise I'm going to have some really bad edge wear right here on the tire, or on the other side, depending on how off it is either way. So that's the reason for doing that. Okay, just a quick recap as to where we're at now. I jacked it up, took off the center cap and all the lug nuts. Then I took out the cotter pin and the 18mm nut on the tie rod. I tapped it to get it out with a hammer. Then I took the 2 bolts out of the caliper and I removed the rotor. Then you also want to go ahead and disconnect your wheel speed sensor from the knuckle and get it unplugged. Then you can take out the 32mm nut for your axle, and both of these are going to be 21mm, the bolt head and the nut, and that's going to get the strut disconnected from the knuckle. So once you've done all that, it should look pretty much just like this. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take an 18mm and a swivel socket on my impact, and I'm going to go ahead and take off that lower ball joint nut. So this is the tool that I'm going to use to get that off. It's got a swivel on it, and then I'm just going to take my impact, and that should get that off pretty easily. Otherwise you're going to have to use a wrench or something. Okay, so I was able to get the knuckle off using a pickle fork, putting it between the ball joint and the bottom of the knuckle. And you know, normally you wouldn't want to use something like that if you're going to reuse the ball joint, because it can damage the boot. But we are replacing the entire control arm, so we will have brand new ball joint and both bushings. This is the one that's bad right here. So now that plate I was telling you about earlier, there are 2 bolts right here next to that little curve that are both 15mm. Those will need to come out in order to get that to slide out. And then we've got one more bolt right here, which I believe is an 18mm. And in order to get that fully removed, we will have to jack up on the transmission just a little bit, but that's not a big deal. Okay, so we do have this bolt out now. I used a random piece of wood I found in my backyard to lift up the transmission. And I used a 21mm ratchet wrench and a 21mm regular wrench, and I was able to get that bolt out. It's a pretty long one, and of course the threads are going to be rusty as all hell, but you can get it off. Luckily I've had this off not that long ago. I actually just replaced this back in March, and that's why I'm replacing it under warranty, because that bushing has failed already. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get the two 15mm bolts out from under that, and we should be able to pry out the whole control arm. Those are the two holes that those 15mm bolts go into. And then once you get those out, you want to come into this area behind the control arm with a pry bar, pry it outward. Then you want to get between that little nub sticking up on top of the control arm and the actual subframe, and you want to pry it forward. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. While you're doing it, you want to hope and pray that the bushing comes out with it. Otherwise, it's going to be a fun time trying to get it out of there. So here we go. Okay, so we got that one out of there. You see that. I'm using this big, giant 3-4 foot long pry bar that I just got from Harbor Freight. That's helping out quite a bit, to be honest. Let me see if I can show the success with one hand on here. We're going to try to get right behind there and pull her out. Let's see if we can do it. I'll probably need two hands. We'll be right back. So we got it out, and of course the bushing did not come with it. So we're going to have to try to fish that out of there with some smaller pry bars and maybe a torch. Okay, so I've almost got the bushing out of there, and I wanted to show you the method that I'm using to do so. Remember my old snap-on pry bar? Telling you, it comes up. You put that hook in there into the hole, and then you can just pry this way. I'm having to use a cheater pipe, but I think if you put something like this in there with enough force, it'll slide it right out, especially if you put a little bit of grease in there the first time you did it, or the last time if that's been done before. Alright, so we finally got it out of there. It's right here. And enough prying on it back and forth. You may have to pry it the other way a little bit, and it kind of pushes it back in, or maybe you can put some lube on it and then push it back in, try to pull it back out, and that'll put some lubrication on it, make it slide a little easier. Then I went ahead and sprayed a whole bunch of the gel liquid WD-40 up in there to try to help ease the new one in. So we are officially at the halfway point. Now we can start putting this brand new control arm in there, and hopefully this one doesn't fail after 7 months or whatever it was again. Okay, so we finally got her pushed in there. It took a whole bunch of lube, and I did have to loosen this up. And I also went ahead and loosened that nut. There's another one right behind it. You can see there's 2 bolts there. I've never had to do that before to get it in, but this one was being a real pain in the ass, and so I just decided to take those off just to try to make it a little easier for myself. Point is, you do not have to take the entire thing off. You can stick a pry bar in between here, pry it down a little, and then kind of see on the control arm where I was tapping it in. You do not want to tap against the bushing because you can damage it. But I was able to get it in there, and I got the bolts back in, all of them, even the 2 15mm that go under there. And then I went ahead and placed the knuckle onto the ball joint stud. So the next thing I'm going to do is put the new nut on there and cotter pin, tighten that up. We'll slide the axle through, and we'll put the rotor back on, and we'll put the axle nut on. Okay, now we've got our cotter pin and nut back on the axle, and we've got our cotter pin and nut on the new ball joint. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the knuckle back into the strut, remembering to try to line this orange mark up as best as I can. I'm going to tighten those up, put the rotor and caliper back on. So now we've got the knuckle put back into place, minding our marks to the best of our ability, and We've also gone ahead and reconnected the wiring here. Now I'm going to go ahead and push these little push pins back into their spots and reconnect the electrical connector that was up here behind the caliper. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and take the caliper off, put it back on the rotor, and reinstall those 21mm bolts. And once I've done those two things, I can put the tie rod back on and the wheel, and we'll be all finished up. Alright, so we got our tie rod in back on and our tire back on. That's kind of what everything looks like right here once it's all finished up. Everything's reconnected just as it should be. So I'm going to take it on a test drive, and that's the end. Alright, and that's the end of our control arm replacement video. If you liked the video or if you found it informative, please go ahead and drop a like below. Also, please go ahead and subscribe for many more videos just like this coming up in the future. Otherwise, hope you have a great rest of your day.